Welcome back to 28storms.com. I am Jason Moreland for your tropical cyclone update on this early Thursday, February 17th, 2011. A quick look shows that we're still dealing with Tropical Cyclone Carlos along the Northern Territory. Yesterday, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center began to issue advisories for Tropical Cyclone Dianne, and now the Bureau of Meteorology has followed suit since that storm has become more organized over the last 12 hours. It's not quite sunrise, so we still have to deal with infrared satellite imagery to get a good handle on the storms. And as you can see, Tropical Cyclone Carlos has not moved much over the last 12 hours, which has been expected. It's still lashing Darwin and surrounding areas with very heavy rainfall. There's been several videos posted of extensive flooding in that area. So please, if you don't have to drive in those areas, please stay home and stay away from flooded roadways. We don't want to have anyone swept away in their cars. Further west, we have Tropical Cyclone Dianne, which is definitely looking more organized this morning, and further intensification is expected. The latest water vapor imagery confirms that upper-level ridging is becoming better established over both tropical cyclones. The upper-level ridge axis that's been located over the southeast Indian Ocean is now extending into western Australia, and we also have a secondary area of ridging over the Northern Territory. The latest SIMS wind shear analysis shows this a bit better. You still have a very large area of ridging over the tropical cyclone over the southeast Indian Ocean, and in fact this ridging has become stronger over the last 24 hours. So conditions, at least in the upper layers of the atmosphere, are looking to be very favorable for Tropical Cyclone Dianne over the next couple days, and I see no reason for that storm not to strengthen significantly as time permits. Okay, and we also have the secondary area of ridging, and as we look at the shear tendency chart, you'll see these areas even better, and the wind shear values have decreased significantly over the Timor Sea and surrounding areas, which is something that the models have been forecasting. As I alluded to in the previous video, it doesn't look like wind shear will be the main deciding factor as to whether or not Carlos strengthens. It will be how much land interaction will occur. And of course, further to the west, we have that large area of ridging where Dianne is set to really intensify. As far as sea surface temperatures are concerned, Tropical Cyclone Carlos has more than enough warm water for it to intensify if it were to in fact stay over the waters. That's more toward this area. But the main reason why I'm showing this image is that it will be more of a question in terms of Tropical Cyclone Dianne's intensity, because there's two model scenarios. There's a chance that the storm can go further out to sea and not really impact anyone, and also significantly weaken as it begins to move into waters below 26 degrees Celsius, which is denoted by this line. However, if it takes a more easterly track toward Exmouth and surrounding areas in that location, it will have warm water to contend with the potential for strengthening all the way up until landfall. Here's the latest look at the oceanic heat content, and this is a measure of not only the amount of heat near the surface of the ocean, but also beneath the surface. So if there's any upwelling due to the strong winds, it will upwell enough warm water to maintain the fuel needed for this storm to maintain itself or intensify. The oceanic heat content is significantly less further down the coast. So if the storm were to wait until it reached about 30 degrees south to really move into Australia, it would be significantly weakened since it doesn't have much heat content to work with. But if it came in further toward the north, it would still be in that warm pocket, so there would not be much in the way of significant weakening. Here's the latest zoomed-in infrared satellite animation of Tropical Cyclone Carlos, and you can see the persistent rain bands that are just continuing to pummel the Northern Territory, and that's expected to persist for the next couple days. So it doesn't look like conditions are really going to improve anytime soon. So people just need to hunker down and try to stay dry and stay out of low-lying areas as best as possible. And of course, all of this convection is going to continue to move southwest along with the storm over the next few days. So please take caution. And if you're down further south, just be ready for some flooding rainfall in all likelihood. Here's the latest radar animation from the area, and you can still see that cyclonic rotation. And I just feel for these areas because the rain is not going to end in the near future, and I know there's already extensive flooding here. Here's the latest water vapor imagery, and there's just a very strong fetch of moisture in this area. Areas further southwest have been kind of lucky so far because there's some dry air and there's not much in the way of precipitation, but again, that's going to change in the near future. Now here is the latest satellite animation of Tropical Cyclone Dianne, and this storm is really beginning to intensify. In the last few frames, you see some really cold cloud tops relatively close to the center, which is a strong indication that the storm is really beginning to intensify, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. And here's the latest look at the water vapor, and there's another strong fetch of moisture. There's no limiting dry air. You do notice this more of a dry air pocket down toward the southwest, but as long as that upper level ridge axis remains located over the storm, it's going to be very hard for any dry air to intrude into the center. Typically, you want the upper level wind shear to be stronger than 15 to 20 knots for any type of dry air entrainment, and that's simply not the case. This was a multispectral image taken of Dianne several hours ago. It looked as though the convection was more toward the northwest of the circulation, which still appears to be the case to some extent, but it looks like the overall structure of that storm has improved since this image was taken. This is also a microwave image of Tropical Cyclone Dianne, and within the last couple frames we really begin to see some intensification near the center. We see a little bit more organization right here. So that's just a quick look at the microwave. Alright, so where are both of these systems headed? Well, this is the latest forecast track from the Bureau of Meteorology, and it shows a track paralleling or actually along the coast over the next several days, with the storm maintaining Category 1 status. It's really not intensifying much at all because it's a little bit removed away from its source of fuel, which is of course the ocean. So relatively steady intensity with little change in strength is forecast, with the track over toward the southwest towards Port Keats. Sorry if I'm butchering any names. I'm not quite as familiar with the geography as I probably should be, but nevertheless, you get the picture. It's going to be heading toward the Daly River, and then Port Keats later on by 4 a.m. on the 19th. Now, this is the latest forecast thinking from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center on Tropical Cyclone Carlos, and this is a bit of a more extended forecast track as well. But as you can see, there's generally good agreement with the southwest motion expected over the next couple days. And unlike previous forecasts, the storm really doesn't get into the open waters as much this time around. Therefore, there's really not much in the way for strengthening or room for strengthening, and therefore the storm simply maintains Category 1 status essentially as it begins to move toward the southwest, and then eventually by the 20th and 21st it begins to fall apart after being removed from the ocean for an extended period of time. Now, for Tropical Cyclone Dianne, things are a little bit more interesting because yesterday the majority of models shifted more toward the west, and now, if anything, today they've shifted ever so slightly to the right, or actually, during the overnight hours when the latest models came out. So the Joint Typhoon Warning Center has adjusted their track ever so slightly toward the east, but it still keeps the core of the storm well offshore. As you can see, the closest approach to the area is on the 18th, which is, of course, a couple days from here. And eventually it shows a hook toward the left as it begins to weaken over the cooler waters that I showed you in the previous few images. Nevertheless, if you look at some of the intensity forecasts, it's expected to peak at about 90 knots, which is a pretty significant cyclone. If you were talking about the Atlantic Saffir-Simpson scale, it would be about 10 knots away from Category 3 major hurricane status, so that's not too far off. The latest forecast from the Bureau of Meteorology is quite similar. It shows strengthening into a Category 3 on the Australian cyclone scale, and it's very close to the coastline of these areas, so areas need to really keep a close watch on this storm system in case it shifts toward the east. So what is the latest model consensus? Well, here's the 12Z ECMWF. This is the current time frame. As we go into 24 hours, the system is weakening over land slightly in terms, I'm talking about Tropical Cyclone Carlos. Here's our developing Tropical Cyclone Dianne further toward the southwest. By 48 hours, both systems make a bit of a comeback. This one re-strengthens a little bit as it's still not that far away from the ocean. Tropical Cyclone Dianne is in no hurry to move anywhere in the near future. By 72 hours, we now have 3 tropical cyclones. This has been the persistent trend in the models over the past several days with developing a storm between the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, and Fiji. That'll be the next area to watch for sure. And by 96 hours, we're still dealing with the remnants of Carlos, and actually Carlos might still be holding on to tropical cyclone status. And look how close Tropical Cyclone Dianne comes to the coast of Western Australia. And again, this is by 96 hours. This is a bit closer than the previous ECMWF model run, which definitely means we're still on the margin of error, so there's still the risk of a landfall. Again, if it came down this far south before making landfall, it would still provide very gusty winds and shower activity, but it wouldn't be nearly as strong in terms of a landfall as it would be if it came in further toward the north. Will it shift more toward the north in future runs? Well, that just remains to be seen. By 120 hours, Carlos is now a remnant low, but it's still along the Western Australian coast, which this would still be an area to watch if it began to shift more toward the north. It's not that far away from open waters, so that's a low that still has to be watched, even regardless if it loses its cyclone categorization name or whatever you want to call it. If it shifts more toward the north, there's always a chance for regeneration. By day 6, or 144 hours, you'll see the two storms over Western Australia beginning to weaken, but this is a full-fledged cyclone nearing severe cyclone status if this model solution were to verify. Alright, so let's take a quick look at the other models. Here's the no-gaps model. By 24 hours, you can see Dianne still swirling out in the Indian Ocean. We still have Tropical Cyclone Carlos near the Northern Territory, and we have disorganized convection located east of the Solomon Islands down near Fiji. Okay, so as we evolve into 48 hours, we see much of the same. By 72 hours, we have an elongated area of surface low pressure which bears watching over the South Pacific. We have a strengthening tropical cyclone Dianne, which is now down to 992 millibars on this forecast. Keep in mind the global models oftentimes underdo the millibar intensity, the lowest surface pressure of tropical cyclones. They have a hard time resolving these systems, so a lot of times the central pressure will be lower than the models are showing. By 96 hours, we're still dealing with tropical cyclone Dianne and the persistent Carlos over the Northern Territory working its way into Western Australia. So this is going to continue to be an active period. We're going to be watching these three systems for an extended period of time. No questions asked, no doubt about it. 120 hours out, still much of the same. By 144 hours, according to this model at least, Dianne is actually pushing off to the southwest in agreement with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center forecast. And we still have a broad area of low pressure which continues to bear watching over the South Pacific. Alright, taking a quick look at the GFS model. As you can see here, by 60 hours, we're actually talking about a brush or almost a direct hit near Exmouth of Western Australia in terms of tropical cyclone Dianne making a landfall. Definitely worth watching. You know, this is a landfall. I mean, this is basically as close as you're going to get without an actual eye passage. And in fact, the eye wall would actually probably be along the coast if this model were to verify. And we still have Carlos, which very well could still be a cyclone at this point. By 72 and 96 hours, Carlos is actually trying to re-emerge over the open waters. So we have a bit of a difference of opinions in the forecast models here. And it looks a bit stronger on this model run than the previous two models that we've looked at already in this map. And look at here. This is the strongest run yet from the GFS in terms of showing a South Pacific cyclone in the medium range. So this is in full agreement with the ECMWF now. And believe it or not, by day 7, the model still keeps all of these storms around the area. Whether that's valid or not, that remains to be seen, but nevertheless, this is an active period ahead. Here's the model consensus, or spaghetti plots for Carlos, and they're in general agreement with a track toward the southwest. This is as of the ZXZ run, so we'll see if these shift more toward the coastline in future runs. That'll bear watching for sure. As far as the intensity forecast, well, it depends on which model you pick because some still take it offshore. Apparently, this model does that, whereas the majority of models show off and on strengthening and weakening as it parallels the coastline. This is the 12Z spaghetti plot for Tropical Cyclone Dianne. The models are pretty much split. Half the models show a brush or essentially a direct hit for portions of the coastline, whereas the remaining half take the storm out to sea. But what's got a very good consensus is the intensity forecast, and generally all the models, or all the reliable intensity models, show some fairly significant strengthening in upwards of 90 knots by 84 to 96 hours. So in summary, we're going to be dealing with both tropical cyclones near Australia for the next several days. It looks like the flooding threat will persist for much of the northern coastline of Western Australia and the Northern Territory throughout the foreseeable future over the next 5 to 6 days. And the latest models have trended a bit more toward the east for Tropical Cyclone Dianne, so areas right along Western Australia near Exmouth and Denham really need to pay attention to that storm. It's really going to intensify, so even if the storm doesn't come directly inland, if it gets close enough, you can still be pelted with the very least of gale force winds. And then further to the east in the South Pacific, it's looking increasingly likely that we will be dealing with a third tropical cyclone, and there's a very real possibility that it could be the strongest out of the three once all is said and done. So check back here at 28storms.com later this afternoon or evening. We're going to post another extensive video update for all three tropical cyclones.